Good morning. I think we're ready to begin this fascinating topic. I'd like to welcome once again Professor Susan Ross. Professor Ross is a professor of theology and emerita faculty at the Loyola University. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago, and she has served as chair of the Department of Theology at Loyola. Before I hand the mic over, let's ask you to briefly pray with me. Good and gracious God, we thank you for the opportunity to gather together in your name and to study your word. Bless our teacher this morning and bless us all with open minds and a healthy curiosity. We ask all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen.
So, good morning, everyone. My voice is a little wonky this morning, but I trust you can hear me well enough. Okay, good. So a couple of things. First of all, I've taught this in my gender and religion class, and it was pretty interesting when we did it. So I hope you'll find it interesting. Often when we talk about issues of gender in the Bible, it has to do with women, which is quite understandable because women are often underrepresented when we talk about biblical stories. Women's voices are often not heard, and I'm all for hearing women's voices. But I think sometimes we don't focus enough on masculinity, and that's obviously a conception of gender as well. And so with this understanding of masculinity, it also, of course, will bear on our understanding of femininity and our understanding of gender as a whole. So a couple of little things to say before I get started with the rest of this. One is that my family was in town this week for an event, and I was sharing with my sisters that I was going to be talking about the story of David and Jonathan, David and Bathsheba. And one of my sisters gave me this blank look. And I mean, we all grew up in the same family, although I went to Catholic school, she didn't. And so I said, "You know about David, right?" She just gave me this blank look. So I have to say, do you know about David? Do people know about David? Is there anybody who doesn't really know about David? Okay, so David, king of Israel, David, the one who slew Goliath, David, the one who had this very close friendship with Jonathan, David, who had this, shall we say, problematic relationship with Bathsheba. So I don't need to go into the whole story, okay? So I was really kind of surprised that I had to sort of recite the story. Secondly, so the story of David and Jonathan obviously has a lot of resonance for many in the LGBTQ community. And in fact, a gay couple that I've known for, I think, over 30 years. In fact, the couple, there was David and there was Randy. But when David and Randy got together, Randy felt that their relationship was so special, he legally changed his name to Jonathan. So it's kind of interesting how the power of the names David and Jonathan come together. So what I want to do today is talk about David and Jonathan. And the first part of this is, this works, right? Yeah. So David and Jonathan, are they a biblical model for a gay couple? And this quotation from 1 Samuel is often used to underscore the significance of their relationship. David says to Jonathan, "Your love for me was wondrous, surpassing the love of women." So it's a very powerful statement. And so what I want to do this morning is offer you 3 interpretations of the David and Jonathan story. And they all in some ways revolve around this question, are they a biblical model for a gay couple? And just, some say maybe, some say yes, some say no. So I thought it would be interesting to look at the ways in which the biblical scholars have understood the relationship between David and Jonathan. And Jonathan was the son of Saul. And so this relationship is kind of fraught in a number of ways. So the first article, well, before we get to the first article, let me just make a couple of comments that all of the biblical scholars that I consulted agree upon. Religion, diplomacy, and war are far more important than the domestic sphere. So that's pretty clear in ancient biblical times. Men are almost always, not always, but almost always at the center of biblical narratives. And then thirdly, same-sex relationships as we know them now were really non-existent in biblical times. We have to remember the social context of all of this and how we understand the LGBTQ community, for example, was non-existent for people in the biblical times. So first interpretation, Saul Oyan, surpassing the love of women. So of course he picks up the quotation from what I just mentioned. Another look at 1 Samuel 26 and the relationship of David and Jonathan. Okay, so what Oyan sees as key here is what he's calling covenant loyalty. Now, covenant is, of course, a major theme in the Hebrew scriptures. And God forming a covenant with Israel, marriage came often to be understood as a covenant. And what love involved was establishing a covenant bond and being faithful to covenant obligations. So a covenant is one person promises to the other and the other person promises back. So this covenant is something that cements relationship, and it's not just this individual sense, it's really kind of out of the community. So this covenant bond is what Oyan sees is at the core of the relationship between David and Jonathan. So he says, David and Jonathan then, they have a covenant, but it seems to be more. It's more than just, if we can say, just a covenant, because a covenant is pretty significant. So what he says is that this issue of covenant loyalty has to do with this relationship that also includes this emotional sense that comes along with it. But a couple of things to note here when we're considering, is this a model for a gay relationship in the Bible? First of all, biblical laws against sexual impropriety. Firstly, the laws that we see that are that get encoded in the biblical tradition actually come from a post-Davidic time, so that it's somewhat non-chronological to see that we look at, say, the laws of Leviticus, that they don't actually, in some ways, apply here because they're later. And then secondly, I hope you don't mind my getting fairly graphic here, they specifically prohibit anal intercourse. They do not mention other forms of intimacy. And so what Oyan says is, so you can't say that their relationship was specifically prohibited because we're never really given the exact details, shall we say, of the nature of their relationship. So is it a homoerotic relationship? Oyan basically says, yeah, probably was. But do we know how it actually played out physically? We know something about how it played out emotionally, but what do we know? There's a lot we don't know. So in this interpretation, he leaves the door open to an interpretation of their physical love for each other. We don't really know How do we understand this? Can we use this as a model for same-sex relationships now? You know, what will my friends David and Jonathan say if one were to say, nah, wasn't about that at all? Well, he says maybe it was. We really don't know. Certainly, they had a very deep and abiding love for each other. What more do we do with it? Well, you know, in some ways, we don't know. So that's our first interpretation here, and from Saul Oyan's article from 2006. It's interesting to look at the dates of all of these because how the scholarship tracks along with the kind of social ideas in the culture. Because, so I'm old enough now that when I was first teaching, and I started teaching in the fall of 1980, I couldn't say the word gay in a classroom without half the class practically fainting. You know, it was just, you just didn't do this. But by the middle 90s, I had students who were very open about who they were in class. And that's a fairly short period of time. But the scholarship is kind of tracking along with where we are in society. So it's kind of interesting to look at the dates of these articles. And when you consider where we are legally in this country and where we were, say, 20 or 30 years ago, it's just really very different. Okay. Number two, another scholar, Yaron Peleg. Love at First Sight, David Jonathan and the Biblical Politics of Gender. So it's actually a year earlier than the other article. So he comments, David and Jonathan are seen as a royal couple by contemporary interpreters, like my friends, David and Jonathan, that they are really, in a sense, the models for how we understand a relationship. But this is an interesting one, and this is not the only article that takes this kind of tack. Peleg actually looks at the relationship of David and Jonathan as like a marital relationship, but a marital relationship not as we would see it, a marriage of two equals, but a marital relationship as it was understood in biblical times as the male being the dominant one and the female being very much the submissive one. So his understanding is kind of interesting. He says, I read this text not only as a story that justifies David's rise to power by emphasizing his masculinity, but also as a text which disqualifies Jonathan politically by emphasizing his femininity. So this particular interpretation looks at Jonathan's relationship with David as one would of a woman to a man, so that he's feminized, and his submission, the submission of Jonathan to David, is utter and complete. So, I mean, I'm not a biblical scholar, as I think I said last week. My area is theology, but I've always found the role of gender and in Scripture to be fascinating. And so what happens here in this particular interpretation is that this author, Peleg's theory is that this relationship is like a marital relationship, but a marital relationship as it would have been understood in ancient Israel. That is, the dominant male and the submissive female. And so because the sexual relations were always understood as something that was done by a powerful person and a less powerful person. And certainly that was the case in ancient Greek culture. If you look at how men related to, say, young boys, that they were, shall we say, penetrable, and that the idea of two equal men in a sexual relationship was really, it was not part of how they understood it. So that Jonathan, in this interpretation, Jonathan becomes feminized, and David's masculinity is emphasized. Some see Jonathan as David's bride. And so this relationship my love to you is as surpassing the love of women. Well, but it is like the love of women. And so, so again, here again is a biblical scholar looking at the same material and coming up with a somewhat different interpretation. So whereas Olean sees this, yes, I open this to a relationship of love between two men. Peleg is saying, well, it is a love between two men, but it is the love of a dominant to a submissive man. So, okay, interpretation number 3. So Anthony Heacock. So this is all part of the same period of time when this relationship is really getting studied. He says, wrongly framed the David and Jonathan narrative in the writing of biblical homosexuality. So what Heacock is pointing out here is it's kind of interesting. I was talking to my husband about this and how we tend to see sexuality. He says, Heacock says, that how we understood sexuality, in a sense, before the modern time, sex was something you did. It was an action, something that was performed by one person with another person. It was not who one was, it was what one did. And that's really what has changed, perhaps especially in the last 50 or so years. I don't know if we would have seen this in quite the same way 100 years ago. But if you understand what it means to talk about saying that how one understands sexuality as a dimension of one's being, which is in a sense how we see it in the present. We talk about how the LGBTQ community, in a sense, is a community of like people. And so for Heacock, we need to see sexuality in the context of the social structures of the time. And so our time is very much a time in which one's, well, we talk about the politics of identity. And so how we see a community together, how we see, say, the women's movement. I think many of you here may be, like me, old enough to remember when the women's movement was kind of finding its voice in the late 60s and into the 70s, where one would be maybe not particularly, especially say in a consciousness raising group. But I certainly remember the feeling of being among a group of women and saying something and someone would say, you too? Yeah, me too. Oh, and so we begin to identify things like there's something called domestic violence, which I'll talk about next week, which is not just, yeah, that's something that some men do to some women, but that it's actually a phenomenon. It's actually a reality. And so as we have come to see what it means to be gay, be lesbian, be trans, that's a dimension of one's personality that is not simply what one does with one's body. And that's Heacock's understanding. So then he says, not only do we need to see sex as how we see it now, but we need to see it in the context of social structures. So that as I learned in teaching students at Loyola who came from all over the world, it was very interesting sometimes to see how one of my Pakistani students would come up to me and say, by the way, Professor Ross, I'm not going to be here for the next 2 weeks because I'm going back to Pakistan to get married. I'd say, oh, it's the first time I remember being kind of shocked. And I'd say, so congratulations. She says, well, we're not going to live together for a couple of years. It's been arranged by our families, and it's part of the social structure. And the idea that I certainly had before being kind of challenged by my students was that arranged marriages, well, that violates one's, ability to choose and everything. No, that was how you did it in their culture. And I came to understand that. So we need to see sex in the context of social structures. And as Heacock points out, ancient cultures fused sex with social units of house, state, class, and religion. In that sense, then the powerful male is the one who has power over all of these areas, where the state helps to ensure the power of men over women, over slaves. Religion itself has a patriarchal dimension. So all of this understandings of our sexuality, or as we would say, our sexuality, is not something that they would have understood in the same way. So he sees phallic power as domination over, kind of an interesting phrase here, inferior penetrable objects of desire. And he rejects the idea that this is a homoerotic relationship, because he says that in this sense, it cannot be a relationship where there is any kind of real mutual love. So he's taking this second interpretation and kind of pushing it a little bit, that it's not a spousal relationship, it's really a power relationship. So that's pretty interesting, you know, when you look at it. So I just want to pause here because we're going to move on, because I'm conscious of the time and I want to leave a fair amount of time for discussion. But I just want to pause here to get a sense. Any questions about this? Anything I may have not made clear in terms of these three interpretations, where one says, nope, it's not. One says, it's really a kind of a powerful, inferior relationship. And the third one that says, yeah, it's basically a same-sex love relationship. So please, yes.
Well, I remember the story, but I don't remember the details. And if we have time, I think it would really help if we could like review the story of David and Jonathan again as a
Yeah, and
refresher.
it's a long story in a sense, because it has to do with their conduct during times of war and everything. But they come to know each other in the context of their both being kind of fellow warriors in the times of, times of a lot of political struggle in ancient Israel. And so they come to know each other. And so Jonathan is the one that really finds himself taken by David's power in some ways, but also because of David's, and quite often David is talked about as a very beautiful man. And so his beauty also has a role in all of this. Yes.
2 points. I was brought up in a fundamentalist religion,
Yes.
and we never heard the name Jonathan. I still am
Oh,
struggling
really?
to
Huh.
think, did I ever come across that? That was never. So I'm going to go home and check my Bible. I wanted to comment on your point about the arranged marriages in Pakistan. You were. So I have come to understand that there is value in arranged marriages for people, because the concept I've been told that they have is that the parents of two people have a better understanding of the nature of each person and what will work best for each person than the people themselves at the age of 21 or the young ages when they get married. And I thought, with all the divorces we have in this country, I think there's probably something to that. So it's something that, even though it's a different culture and they have their own way of doing it, I think it just makes sense in many ways.
The other thing that I should point out in addition to that is the fact that marriage is not simply a relationship between two people, two individual people. It's a relationship between two families. And so it's often the tradition that the bride moves into the family of her husband. And so in that it also is seen in terms of economic relationships, the extended family. And so our sense that this is really just about me, and, you know, is I sometimes hear from, you know, my students, well, you know, why do I need like a, you know, a marriage license or anything? It's a private matter between, the person that I love and me. Maybe that's how we see it in this particular context, but a lot of the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. And so this sense that marriage is a much larger institution is something to bear in mind. So thanks for your question.
I think this will be a quick one. The three scholars whose writings you selected,
Yeah.
I assume those three scholars are Christian, not Jewish, and this isn't something from a midrash. This is actually the Christian scholars' interpretation. Is that correct?
I have tried to find out whether there's a denominational affiliation for any of the scholars, and it's really kind of hard to tell. So I'm not sure if they are Christian or Jewish or whatever. But the interesting thing, though, that I have found with biblical scholarship that I would consider mainstream, which would mean historical critical scholarship, literary scholarship, all the kinds of things that one can bring to it, is that religious affiliations kind of go by the wayside. I find that with my Catholic and Protestant colleagues in the same area in Bible, whether or not one is Jewish, Catholic, Presbyterian, Baptist, whatever, often doesn't seem to matter very much, that kind of scholarship. The flip side of that, though, and this is a larger question, the flip side of that, though, is sometimes one's faith commitment is not seen as relevant at all. And so one of the big issues that people kind of struggle with in contemporary biblical scholarship is what does it matter to be a faithful scholar? So just a really quick short story. Sandra Schneiders, who's a nun, Catholic nun, and a biblical scholar, was at the Institut Catholique in Paris. She tells the story in one of her books, and she was in a seminar with a famous biblical scholar. And so she said to him, well, what does it matter? What does the faith commitment of the biblical scholar matter? And the biblical scholar, who was actually a priest, said, pas du tout, not at all. It matters not at all. And so her effort has always been to try and say, can we totally leave that out? So good question. Yeah.
I was wondering if the expression blood brother
Oh.
is ever used in this, going back to the first person you were talking about, because in the Jewish tradition, sprinkling of blood
Yeah.
maybe on Yom Kippur. So could this be a blood brother relationship?
That's a good question. And I don't think I'm really the right person to give a really solid answer to that, because, I use this, and I have to sort of ask your forbearance here, that I'm used to doing this with students who know very, very little about the Bible, and I'm trying to get them interested in it. And so my knowledge of these biblical texts and of their interpretations comes from, my ability to read scholarly texts in, I think, a fairly intelligent way. But I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I'm not a New Testament scholar. So my question in coming to this text is basically, do we see these as a kind of support for a biblical warrant for gay relationships? Now, probably many of you are aware that what they call what are they called? The text, the clobber texts. That's what the LGBTQ community often refers to various biblical passages as the clobber texts, which are the ones that people use to say, see, no, you can't have, this is against God's word and all of that. In the New Vatican Statement that came out, which is a whole other story, which you may or may not be aware of. But for example, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, that's not about gay relationships. That's about violation of hospitality and power relationships. It's the rape is making the men who are assaulted kind of feminized and in a position of being raped, literally. And so it does not have to do with a consensual same-sex relationship. So, I mean, that's just one little part of this that what I call all these, there are, I think, 8 or 9 various texts that you can pull out that basically those who are trying to make the case that the Bible is very much against any kind of sanction of same-sex loving relationships, they'll pull out these texts to say here, and they're often out of context. Okay, shall I move on to David and Bathsheba? Okay, so that's this is another story. So hopefully we'll have a little bit more time too to talk about this. So here's David again, and the story of, trying to get my second page here, the story of David and Bathsheba. Sarah Koenig's article, Make War Not Love, the Limits of David's Hegemonic Masculinity in 2 Samuel 10 to 12. Now you're familiar with the story of David and Bathsheba. David sees Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop nearby, thinks to himself, yeah, like this woman. So he, I'm trying to figure out how to describe, he has sex with her. Is this consensual or not? It's one of the questions. She gets pregnant. Meanwhile, the country is at war. Her husband Uriah is on the battlefield. David calls Uriah back from the battlefield, is basically like, okay, you and Bathsheba get together because I don't want to be held responsible for this child. And so Uriah refuses. And so Bathsheba has the baby dies. And then Uriah is also sent back to the battlefield, and Uriah is killed deliberately by David. So you're familiar with that story. Okay. So how do we understand this masculinity? And what Koenig is referring to here is hegemonic masculinity, is a masculinity that is in charge. So the hegemony is the one who is the one over others. And so her point here, and I found it very, very fascinating, it's about the limits of David's hegemonic masculinity in this particular story. So, there are 3 foci to this: war, sex, and hegemonic masculinity. So what she is trying to show is that rather than seeing David as the all-powerful male in this story, so that he's the great warrior, he's the one who has sexual power over Bathsheba, and he is the model of the powerful male. In fact, she says, the text itself is undercutting his hegemonic masculinity, which is really interesting, because when one reads some of these biblical texts, one is tempted to just sort of take them at their word, so to speak. And as I was commenting last week, to see how one can read to reject these texts as models of behavior and people that we would not like to be. And so what Koenig is trying to point out here is the subtleties in the texts themselves, and how the texts may, in this fascinating kind of literary way, show how this is not quite what it may seem to be. And so you have to know a little bit about what's going on. So there are 3 foci here. So we'll deal with war first. So the narrative of the Ammonite war, she sees as a challenge to David's masculinity. So what does a good leader do in times of war? He leads his troops into battle. But David doesn't do that here. David sends Joab to lead the army. Joab is his chief general. David stays in Jerusalem. And this is not what a great military leader would do. So her first point here is to say, even at the beginning of the story, while this war is going on, what is David doing in Jerusalem? David ought to be out there on the battlefield. And the text doesn't sort of raise the question itself, saying, see, David is in Jerusalem, he ought to be out on the battlefield, but he's not. But anybody reading this and knowing what is done and what is understood to be the role of a great general would be thinking this. What is he doing there? Why is he not with his troops? So Joab goes there, and eventually Joab gets killed too. But that's later in the story. Now, the more interesting part of this is the sex part of it, of course. So Bathsheba, and if you've ever seen, say, what was it, Gregory Peck and who else was in the David and Bathsheba, the old movie that goes back to the 50s or so, so that Bathsheba is often portrayed as this very beautiful, seductive woman who's out there knowing David is looking and basically trying to seduce him. Well, there's some things to unpack here. So why would she have been bathing on her rooftop? Well, that's where you collected the water. And that's where, if you were needing to do your ritual bath after your menstrual cycle, that's where you would be. And you would be there, and she was there with her maidservant. She was there taking her ritual bath. So David, the king, and her husband's boss basically says, I'd like you to come over and, come up and see my etchings, the equivalent of that. So would it have been possible for her to refuse? Well, I mean, that's a question that we ask now, and that I think the text is also asking us about, what kind of power does she, as a woman and as the wife of one of his generals, what power does she have to say no? So that's the first question here. Then secondly, if one is in a war, and this is how the culture understood it, one doesn't have sex during war. So for David not to go out to war and instead be in Jerusalem, having sex with Bathsheba shows he's not a successful masculine leader. So not only is he back in Jerusalem, but he's violating the kind of code of conduct that male soldiers would have had during war. I mean, this is not always honored, of course, when one thinks about how sex and rape are used as weapons and have been for thousands of years in ancient and modern civilizations. And so David not only is not in war, but he's out there seducing his general's wife. And then third, he's unable to control the result of sex with Bathsheba, her pregnancy and the loss of her and David's child. Remember, David goes to pray when the child is sick, when she finally has the child, which is getting ahead of the story. And David is powerless to control whether or not the child survives. Then third, in terms of his masculinity, David couldn't force Uriah to have sex with his wife. Uriah was the one who is modeling the kind of masculinity that David should have been modeling at this time, because David brings Uriah back from the battlefield, says, here, there's this nice place for the two of you to reconnect. And Uriah says, no, I'm with my men. I'm still in battle. And Uriah has self-control, unlike David. And then what Koenig also points out is labeling him the Hittite is a kind of code word for looking at the kind of racial dynamics of what are going on in here, and that he is not, I'm not sure who exactly the Hittites were, but the fact that he belongs to a community that is different from David's seems to suggest that there is some kind of inferiority going on there. So, so in all three ways here. So first of all, David shows himself to be a weak leader. He's not there in the war. He's not really doing the job. Secondly, in terms of sex, he's giving in to his own sexual urges and not showing how he has power over them or over others. And then thirdly, in terms of just the sense of his masculinity, who really has hegemonic masculinity, or who really shows the power of masculinity here, a model masculinity, it would be Uriah. And so what happens, Uriah comes back, refuses to have sex with Bathsheba. So Uriah gets sent back into the battlefield, and David tells Joab, put him on the front lines. So, of course, Uriah gets killed. And it's just, it's an awful story in a lot of ways. And then, of course, this is not necessarily part of this, but you may be familiar with the kind of follow-up to this where Nathan comes to talk to David, Nathan the prophet, and Nathan tells him a story of this man who has just a very small flock of sheep, and someone comes in and takes his prized sheep and kills it. And David is furious at this man. How could he do this? And Nathan looks at David and says, you are that man. And so, you can look at David also as an example of how someone who is very flawed, many ways, as we will see in other biblical figures, how a very, very flawed character is still chosen by God to lead his people and to, be so, shall we say, lionized as one of the leading figures of the scriptures. So I want to have, what Koenig points out is all of these events show the fragility and instability of David's masculinity. So it's just, David is this model of the model man of the Bible, as David is often portrayed. I think of the statue in Florence, that maybe some of you have seen, the enormous statue of David in Florence, which is, 12 feet tall or something. And here he is, Michelangelo has this incredible sculpture of his power. Here he is. It's David, of course, the youth, before he uses his slingshot to kill Goliath. But ultimately, the one with ultimate power is Yahweh. The one with ultimate power is God. And in a sense, what Koenig points out, and I think it's really interesting how she does this, that this is showing not only David's fragile masculinity, but it's really showing God's power. And God is the one that basically, even though David is such a flawed character, that this flawed character can still be the instrument of what God wants to see done in the community. So let me stop here, and we've got about 15 minutes or so to open up for questions or comments about how we understand some of these people. The women are kind of in the back seat here, I have to say. So what do we do with Bathsheba? So there are midrashes that one can use to talk about Bathsheba. But yes, please, go ahead.
So I am not familiar with the whole text, and I would appreciate it if you told me or others, did David's followers understand what went on, and did that affect his ability to lead? And secondly, what happened with Bathsheba?
Oh,
and
yes, yes. Well, In terms of his followers, I don't really know, and the text doesn't really go into it. He is still the king, at this particular point. No, no. Perhaps like some other leaders we know in the present who have sexual improprieties, there are ways of, saying, well, that doesn't really matter. What really matters is his power. What does happen is she does get pregnant. She has a baby. Her husband is killed. Imagine how she feels. Here she has been in some ways kind of coerced into this relationship, getting, carrying a baby for 9 months, having the baby die. And that's when, of course, David goes and prays for the baby's life. Baby still dies. But he marries her. They go on to have another baby, at least one other baby. I was looking, and David had 8 wives altogether, and he had 18 children that are named. And you may be familiar with the name of one of his children, Solomon. Okay, so Solomon. So God still, blesses David with another son. And Solomon is the one that gets to build the temple. David doesn't, because he was not a very good boy, shall we say. So yeah, the story, it's a complex story. And again, there's things having to do with the kind of political relationships in the ancient Near East, most of which are, at least I have to be honest, kind of a blur to me. I don't exactly know who the Ammonites were, but it was a time of constant battles. And sort of politically, it's a time of battles. It's also a time when the prophets are trying to get Israel to be monotheistic. And that's a struggle. Talk about the Queen of Sheba comes in. Who does she represent with Solomon, remember? Well, you may not remember, but yeah. So that the whole issue, of course, we want to see that Judaism is this monotheistic religion as opposed to all of these other polytheistic, whatever. But it's not quite that easy. I remember also being in graduate school. You might remember this too, Jeff, and hearing one of my professors talk about the ancient Egyptian Psalms. And I remember reading these Psalms and thinking, wow, I couldn't tell the difference between the Egyptian Psalms and the Hebrew Psalms. That the culture was a lot more porous than we come to see it in, because of course the biblical texts are being written and edited and re-edited and reorganized so as to present a picture, of faithful, sometimes not so faithful, monotheism to the people, but also faithful to God, who is bringing special favor to Israel. Does that help in answering?
Absolutely.
Okay,
But I
good.
just wanted to put, interfaith marriages, if there was a Hittite, he would not be Jewish, is that correct?
Probably not.
And Bathsheba, was she Jewish? Hebrew.
I'm not really, it's a good question. I wish I knew all those answers.
Sheba coming from the south.
Right.
Would not be Jewish.
Probably not, no.
Anyway, it's a lot of interfaith stuff going on.
Yeah,
But
there
it's
is.
Not arranged marriages. This family would not arrange those marriages.
Oh, well, still some of the marriages were arranged.
Even
Well, we're talking about the kingly level here. They can kind of do what they want. It's when you get down to the people. So, when you think about sort of other marriage stories, sort of, my brain is, so Rachel and Leah, of course, who were Jacob's 2 wives. Jacob wanted to marry Leah, but he was forced to work all these years and I get my stories at this point I have to kind of go back. But anyway, it's complex, so that marriage is not necessarily monogamous in the ancient Israelite world, right?
Professor, on that
Okay.
Bathsheba business, she gets called out in the genealogy of Jesus,
She does.
but not by name. Oh, then but not by name. She
Well-
gets called out as the mother of Solomon, but
Yeah.
it's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And I
Yeah.
was just wondering if you could mind that a little bit.
Well, in terms of the genealogy, so Tamar is also named, I think, and she's the one that gets raped by her brother. There's the genealogy is really interesting because it shows I mean, it's not just all this, flowers and beautiful things. It's a pretty violent kind of genealogy there.
It was interesting to talk with a friend briefly in coffee hour before the class. He's going to be leading the men's Bible study in a few
Oh,
weeks.
okay.
And he said, I've always struggled with why Jesus had to come from the house of David. He said, with all this we understand. And I was just curious about theological reflections that you haven't already said. I think the power of the flawed, mighty king, but very human, in the shadow of
Right.
the Almighty God is clearly one way. But if you've got other comments on the significance in the Gospels of Jesus coming from the house of David.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I'm just kind of on, just as I respond to this sort of in the moment, what it seems to say to me is that God works through us in all kinds of interesting ways, so that David is obviously an incredibly flawed person. Peter is obviously a very flawed person. I mean, Moses himself is not allowed to see the promised land because he doubted God's word earlier, So it just makes the Bible that much more fascinating, I think, when you look at these obviously flawed persons, flawed characters, and how they ultimately are able to carry out sort of what God is all about in us. And so, I just was looking at something, how you see these memes come across the internet, and somebody was writing about how, how is it that so many people want to say, I can't believe in a God that would allow all of this suffering, et cetera, all these terrible things to happen. But this person's comment was, how is it that this God is with us in all of this? That's what God's promise is, not so much. God doesn't say, I'm going to make everything perfect for you. God basically says, both in the Hebrew scriptures and in the New Testament, I'll be there for you. That's what God is basically saying. And the famous biblical scholar, I guess he was a biblical scholar, a Jesuit theologian named John Courtney Murray, does this little book about, calls The Problem of God. And he says that the best translation that we know of in terms of the I am who am is I will be there as who I am for you. That's what that I am means. And it's I'll be there for you. And so I'll be there no matter what. And so how we then put that along free will, the world itself, I mean, it's just, yeah, kind of mind-blowing. Thanks. Yeah. And another question. Yes, thanks.
Is there any suggestion in the biblical text that David felt any remorse or that he repented for his actions?
Yes, I think so. So I think certainly when he's praying for the life of the child, the first child that Bathsheba has, certainly there, yes, he is expressing his remorse. Ultimately, is he a totally changed man? I don't think so. He's this flawed character, who does what he thinks he needs to do to be a powerful king. But he is credited with so many of the Psalms, and there's no reason to believe that that's false. And there's a lot of lament in the Psalms. There's sorrow for what one has done. And so he's a complex character who really let his ego take over. That's a good question.
Anybody else?
Okay.
Once again, Professor, could you give us a little sneak preview of what coming
Oh.
attractions?
Oh, okay. So today was masculinity. So next week I want to talk about a couple of texts. One is the book of Hosea, one of the prophetic books. And you might want to take a look at Hosea, which is a fairly short book. But Hosea is asked to take a wife who kind of symbolizes the infidelity of Israel. And so what I want to share with you is what some scholars have said about the role of the harlot wife in the Hebrew scriptures. And then along with that, there's a passage in 2 Peter that basically says wives should be silent in the churches. They should ask their husbands, for whatever they need to know in terms of the scriptures. And the wives should be obedient to their husbands. And then a third text, I want to go back to the interreligious stuff. There's a text in the Quran that basically says if a wife is disobedient to her husband, the husband has the authority to beat her. And so how does a feminist Muslim scholar deal with a text like that? So what I want to talk about is how feminist biblical scholars have looked at these texts and maintained that the God of Israel, the God of Jesus Christ, Allah, are not sanctioning brutal behavior to women on the part of powerful men. So, and especially those texts are often cited as ways of justifying how it is that men have charge over women. So I want to end, it sounds kind of negative, but I'll actually end on a note that shows how these texts can be understood as a way for us here now to try and wrestle with them and to realize how we can respond differently. So that's next week.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.